Oysters are a popular seafood in Australia. They're farmed along the Hawkesbury River in New South Wales. It's a big industry, but a deadly virus called the QX virus has killed almost all the oysters, and the farmers can't make any money. Let's take a look at the story. Then we'll talk about some of the words used to describe the river and also some of the science words in the story.
The Hawkesbury River used to be a hub of activity at low tide, with oyster farmers, workers and their punts dotting the river's edge. But on this cold winter's morning, it's deserted.
Well, once our scientists had evaluated the development of the QX disease within the oysters grown in the Hawkesbury, they came to the conclusion we should close it down, which we did. This was to prevent any spread across the state, and particularly into, say, Brisbane waters, which is an adjoining estuary.
50 workers have been laid off and half of the farmers have abandoned their leases. Rob Moxham is a fourth-generation oyster grower.
A very small percentage of the oysters will survive it. They're probably resistant to the QX, but that's one that's in the process of dying, and the parasite infects the gut and it starves the oyster, and the oyster gradually gets poorer and poorer and poorer until it just can't survive. But it takes months and months to kill it.
There are two types of oysters grown in New South Wales. The indigenous Sydney rock, which takes 3 to 4 years to mature, and an introduced species called the Pacific oyster, which takes just 18 months to grow to full size. The farmers along the Hawkesbury only grew Sydney rock oysters. Winter isn't peak season for oyster sales, but with the Hawkesbury closed down, there's a squeeze on supplies and prices have already gone up. Retailers say that come spring and Christmas, Sydney rock oysters will be hard to find and cost a lot more. And prices are likely to stay high for some time. It will be at least 3 years before the Hawkesbury River could produce another Sydney rock oyster. In April, the Minister for Primary Industries, Ian MacDonald, and the Premier Bob Carr visited the farmers and offered an immediate rescue package. It included 200,000 QX-resistant juvenile Sydney rock oysters, a $200,000 grant to supply more oysters next year when the breeding season restarts. The government offered to waive fees and rents, to provide free financial advice and to set up a task force to look at the long and short-term solutions. Well, what do you say to the oyster farmers who are in dire straits?
Well, we're working hard on their situation. We'll have an overall package by the 20th of June, but also we've just secured 5 million Pacific oysters for immediate delivery, and so we'll be looking on that and working with them on how we can roll that out into the river. That would get them into production very quickly.
The Minister only secured the Pacific oysters from Tasmania this morning. But despite the good news, the farmers are adamant the clean-up package is the only way forward. They say they're worried by the intensity of the parasite in the river and want to clean up the leases quickly. Earlier this year, a few growers thought they'd try their hand at growing Pacifics. Rob Moxham was one. He says 70% of his crop is now dead. How much longer can you survive? You've laid off some staff already.
Well, I've really came to the end of my resources. I can't hang on any longer.
The Sydney rock oyster grows in the Hawkesbury River in New South Wales. In the last 2 years, the oyster industry has been badly affected by the QX virus. Let's see how the river has changed.
The Hawkesbury River used to be a hub of activity at low tide, with oyster farmers, workers and their punts dotting the river's edge. But on this cold winter's morning, it's deserted.
The Hawkesbury River used to be a hub of activity at low tide. A hub is a centre. So a hub of activity is a place at the centre of activity. There used to be a lot of activity at low tide on the river. Low tide is the time when the sea has reached its lowest level. At low tide, the river was busy. Oyster farmers worked there and their punts dotted the river's edge. A punt is a long, narrow boat, and here the word dotted means scattered or spread across an area. What's the river like now? Listen again.
The Hawkesbury River used to be a hub of activity at low tide, with oyster farmers, workers and their punts dotting the river's edge. But on this cold winter's morning, it's deserted.
On this cold winter's morning, the river is deserted. If a place is deserted, it's abandoned or empty. There are no people in there. So why has the river changed so much?
Well, once our scientists had evaluated the development of the QX disease within the oysters grown in the Hawkesbury, they came to the conclusion we should close it down, which we did.
The government closed the river. The scientists evaluated the development of the QX disease within the oysters in the river. To evaluate means to judge the quality, importance or value of something. Scientists tested the oysters so they could see what was happening with the disease. They came to the conclusion that they should close the oyster farms on the river. Your conclusion is the final opinion you have after considering all the information about something. To come to a conclusion means to form an opinion. So the scientists came to a conclusion about the river. They shut down the area. Let's hear more about the QX disease.
A very small percentage of the oysters will survive it. They're probably resistant to the QX.
A very small percentage of oysters will survive if they've built up a resistance. Resistance means defence. It's the state of being protected or defended against something. If something has built up a resistance to a disease, it's become protected against the disease. The opposite of resistant is susceptible. Susceptible means easily harmed by something. Most oysters are susceptible to the QX virus. That's why only a small percentage survive. What about the farmers? How are they going to manage without having enough oysters to harvest?
How much longer can you survive? You've laid off some staff already.
Well, I've really came to the end of my resources. I can't hang on any longer.
Rob Moxham is an oyster farmer. He says he's come to the end of his resources. Here, resources are valuable qualities or possessions. Rob's talking about the resources of his business. The money, equipment and staff are Rob's resources. He's reached the end of his resources. He doesn't have anything left. Rob says he can't hang on any longer. To hang on means to continue or keep going. Rob can't continue his business. He's ready to give up. The government is trying to help the farmers, but Rob thinks it might be too late. And that's all for today. If you'd like to take another look at the Hawkesbury River oysters, don't forget you can watch the story again on the English Bites website.